Today is September 16th, and you're listening to the City of Los Angeles Audits Committee. I'm Nuri Martinez, the chair, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Mr. Blumenfield and Mr. Parks. We can get started now. Mr. Clerk, can you read the item into the record, please?
Yes, Madam Chair. Item number 1 is a City Controller Report relative to the performance audit of the city's Foreclosure Registry program and the Housing and Community Investment Department's July 3, 2014 response. The committee may recess to close session in order to confer with the legal counsel in relation to anticipated litigation pursuant to Government Code Section 54956.9 sub D2 E1.
Okay, thank you. Obviously, we are a few years into the original implementation of this critical ordinance that the City of Los Angeles established after so many neighborhoods were flooded by our huge spike in foreclosures that we saw back in 2008 and 2011. And as we all know, many of those foreclosures led to the blight in our communities due to the nuisance activities and the lack of maintenance and security. The council at the time took some steps to try to eliminate some of this blight, and certainly the thoughts were in the right place. But we obviously need to fine-tune those actions in order to make sure that we are fully functional and lift the burden off of our neighborhoods. So with that, I wanted to welcome our City Controller, Ron Galpin. You can start.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Martinez, honorable council members. Thank you for inviting me this afternoon to discuss the City Controller's audit of the Foreclosure Registry program. And thank you so much for spotlighting this very important issue of blight in our neighborhoods. I thought I would take a few moments to just do a general overview, and then I'm available to answer questions, and we have our auditors as well who can go into even further depth. I'd also like to, by the way, thank Councilmember Cedillo for his leadership on this issue, along with Rushmore Cervantes of HCID in his cooperation with our audit, and to also recognize the efforts and to thank SCIU 721, ACE, and many other community members who have joined together to press for safer, cleaner communities across Los Angeles. Some quick background. The recent financial crisis resulted in more than 56,000 completed non-judicial foreclosures, that is, sales of single-family and multi-unit residential properties in the city of Los Angeles between 2010 and 2013. Just a quick overview of what the foreclosure process is. There is both judicial and non-judicial foreclosure, but residential foreclosures will almost always go through the non-judicial route, not involving a court. And what happens is when there is not payment made, there is a NOD, or a notice of default, and that is recorded. The homeowner can cure that default if 90 days has passed or a greater period, and there's still no cure of that default. Then there's a notice of trustee sale. Often it takes much longer than 90 days. That's the minimum. And that's the official notice that the home will be sold at an auction and according to the California laws. And then there's the trustee's deed upon sale, which occurs when a sale actually occurs. Now, a certain period of time has to pass between the notice of trustee sale and that sale, and there are many intervening factors that may come about that may postpone that. But with a trustee's deed upon sale, which happens upon a sale, it can go either to a third-party purchaser or it can go back to the lender, aka the beneficiary. When that happens, then it ends up in the portfolio of that lender, of that beneficiary, and what you have is then an REO, and it can take quite a long time for that to be sold. During the foreclosure process, the condition, of course, can really deteriorate because of neglect. That neglect may be because of the person who is occupying the house. It may be the borrower. It may be some other occupant of the house, or it may be deteriorating just because there is nobody occupying or taking care of that house. And the high rates of foreclosed properties and of abandoned properties also can lead to a decrease in property values and a destabilization of our neighborhoods. And we saw that in quite a number of neighborhoods. Thankfully, the numbers on foreclosures have been declining, but they still are present, of course. Now, the Foreclosure Registry program was established in 2010. It was intended to track foreclosures, to prevent neighborhood degradation, to impose fines and penalties for these blighted properties. It also required lenders to register properties and pay an annual registration fee of $155 when they initiate that residential foreclosure in the form of that NOD, that notice of default. It was well-intentioned, but I have to concede I think it was flawed and perhaps even doomed to failure in some ways. Our audit found that the program did not achieve a good return on investment for Angelinos and really had a lot of problems meeting its stated objectives. So a couple things that I will call to your attention in terms of what didn't work, and then I'll get to our proposals of what we think would work. First of all, we really believe that the ordinance went after too big a sphere. There's actually a Venn diagram that we have in the audit. This is on page Roman numeral 6. And what it does is it looks at all of the notices of default, and of those, how many were notices of trustee sale, how many actually resulted in trustee sales, how many went back to the beneficiary, and then the number of blighted properties is somewhat unknown, but it's, as one can see from this Venn diagram, a much smaller portion of the whole. And so we really think that a more tightly crafted ordinance, and one that will really go after the properties that are the problem, will be much more beneficial to our neighborhoods and to the city. Second is, though HCID collected about $5 million in registration fees from July 2010 to March of 2014, there were no penalties for blighted or abandoned properties that were collected during this period. And about $3.7 million is in a special fund account. And there are a number of issues about how it can or cannot be spent, and I know that you'll be conferring with the city attorney on that issue. But some questions about whether it can be spent, as it were, for abatement, even though that might be the desire of many folks. Problems also with the annual registration and enforcing of that. First of all, whether it really should be an annual registration fee, because foreclosure is not the kind of thing that it goes on typically for year after year after year. What if you have a foreclosure that is started in December? Does that mean you have to now re-register again and pay the fee again in January? And then also, how do you actually enforce this in terms of tracking the lenders? Also, as I said, it was, I think, a real issue about requiring these lenders to register at the time of notice of default when, quite frankly, they do not typically legally possess the property. In fact, don't even necessarily have access to enter that property and may be found to be trespassing if they do, and that's an issue. And then, of course, legal issues in terms of federally insured loans and loans that were under MERS, the Mortgage Electronic Registration System, and again, that's something for the city attorney to elaborate on. And then the database that was set up wasn't really comprehensive. And part of that is because we really relied on the banks or on the either the trustee or the beneficiary to provide that information, rather than drawing it from other sources where it can be more automatically generated. Now, with all that said, since the audit process began, HCID has made some notable improvements, including validating local contact information, including beginning to provide data from the registry to LADBS on a regular basis. That's another one of the things that we pointed out in our audit as needing to be done. And it's also provided a recent submittal to our office. Actually, I received it as of yesterday, regarding the geo-registry and some of the ideas that they have about how that would be put together. I do have some questions about that. I'd like it to be less versus more complex, and I'd like it to sort of avoid some of the issues that we've had heretofore. Now, as outlined in Appendix 2 and also in Councilmember Cedillo's motion, I think there's really an opportunity to fill a key gap identified in the audit by implementing inspection and enforcement program that will be proactive to address and prevent blight, because this is not just about collecting fees. Ideally, you want to prevent blight. And the audit recommendations lay out what our action plan, as it were, would be for a geo-registry, and that's the creation of a largely self-populating geo-registry to track properties and their legal owners in the foreclosure process more efficiently. Page 21 of the audit actually has got details about where that kind of information might be pulled from, and this could be from property profiles, from title companies, from various kinds of recordations that are made with the assessor's office, bankruptcy filings, etc. And there are a number of private firms that put this information together at a relatively low cost, and some of that is now being assembled also by HCID. and inspection of homes when lenders have actually taken legal ownership of the property. Because to require that at a time when they don't control it and when they don't own it, we personally had come to the conclusion it's going to be really difficult to enforce. But once they actually have taken ownership of the property, that's, I think, a time to do it, even though it should be said that just because they own it or it's gone back to them doesn't actually mean they have possession of it. They may have to do a UD, an unlawful detainer, but that can be figured out how to work that with the ordinance. Streamlining collection of registration and inspection fees would also help to fund a robust blight mitigation and code enforcement program, ideally, and to ensure that the responsible parties perform legally mandated maintenance. We also list in the audit on pages 22 to 23 what I think are some of the benefits of this geo-registry, and that includes neighborhood preservation, foreclosure preservation and assistance, loan and loan guarantee programs, potentially, depends on how that money might or might not be used. Moreover, that information might help even if the money is not being used for that. It might help for other programs that the city has, for code enforcement, and overall, we believe that this will increase the effectiveness of our collection of fines and penalties, allow us to invest in code enforcement and nuisance abatement, and improve the condition of blighted properties, which is, after all, what this is all about. And I believe that with these changes, we can achieve a great deal of reform and improvement for all of our neighborhoods and a much better ROI on the money that it is that we are seeking to collect. I'd be happy to answer questions and to also invite our auditors to come up and to introduce themselves, and they'd be available to answer questions as well. So thank you very much for taking on this very important issue.
You raised a lot of really interesting comments regarding the geo-registry, which I want to come back to.
Okay.
If I have someone from the housing department, someone here, I have a couple of questions.
Good afternoon. Roberto Aldape from the Housing and Community Investment Department.
So what I'm most worried about is the amount of time that passes between the NOD and the REO in terms of how we protect neighborhoods, because there is an amount of time that kind of goes by. So how does the foreclosure registry actually protect neighborhoods during this time?
Well, we did a cursory look at that in terms of the period of time between an NOD and an actual REO, and it can range anywhere between a year and a half to 2 years.
Right.
Within the Housing and Community Investment Department, we have a systematic code enforcement program as well as a complaint-based program that handles the 760,000 multifamily units in the city of Los Angeles. The single-family and the vacant multifamilies are handled by the Department of Building and Safety. So during that time where it is between the NOD and the REO, our program within, our core service program within the Housing and Community Investment Department handles those type of blighted properties.
So is that what you're... But my understanding is you don't even know what properties are out there. Is that correct? I mean, I thought part of the problem was that we weren't necessarily communicating these complaints to the departments, and so therefore there isn't a database in which they can go back and check on these properties. That was my understanding when I read this.
Well, I'll share my perspective. First of all, what we're recommending is that the details of the geo-registry and all of the information about these properties be input at the time that there is an NOD, and that information can be acquired in a whole variety of different ways. The requirement upon the lender would come in at such time as they acquire the property. If there are ways to enforce things upon lenders before they own the property, then that's something I think worth consulting the city attorney on. But it is a legitimate point that you raise, which is to say that a rather extensive period can pass between the NOD and actually it becoming an REO. Sometimes it can be as quick as several months, but it can also be much longer than that. And then you can go cite the borrower who is in that property and who is the owner of the property at that time. Although if they're in foreclosure, they're probably in financial distress
Right, it wouldn't
and
make sense.
may very well not have the money to make those repairs. And you can keep on citing them, but then how are they going to find the money to make those repairs? But having the information about what those troubled properties are at least helps us to perhaps look at what other kind of programs might be in place to assist those people who legitimately cannot afford to keep that property up.
And so are staff currently manually entering all the dates from the Real Quest data?
Hi, my name is Helen Morales from the House and Community Investment Department, and I just wanted to answer some of these questions to you. We actually have a contract with RealQuest, and so we're obtaining that data weekly, so we know when an NOD has been filed. And so it's not like we don't know this universe.
That we do know now.
We have the NOD data. Also, there's really no other way that we can get that data. We've inquired at that at the beginning of this program. So the RealQuest is the real database that provides us with the information that we need to go out there and get this data. So we know when the NOD has been filed. Additionally, with regards to the length of time from NOD to REO, we did a search of all of our registrations. 80% of all of our registered properties registered 2 or more years, which means that they're staying in the NOD process before an REO ever happens. And those are the properties, because there's concern, they haven't had the funds to make the repairs to begin with, and so they're into financial constraints, and then when the property is left and it's left abandoned, it's in a worse condition. And so I think that the NOD stage is the right and proper way and time to address these issues and to obtain that data. Now, we obtain a lot of data, and we have received calls from constituents and actually went to the registry, contact the individuals that we have on there and said, look, there's an issue with this property. Can you go out there and deal with it? And they did. And so this is how we address blighted properties at a very minimum, but it does address the issue of the constituency and the concern that we have out there. Additionally, we've met with Wells Fargo, and I just spoke with U.S. Bank this morning about their concerns on all of these properties. 80% of all properties go back to the GSEs, one of the government-sponsored entities, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. They are mandating these servicers, because that's what they are in the process. Most of them are in trusts. So they go through a servicing process, and they go back to the servicer before they even get into the REO status. And so what happens to these servicers in this process is that they're required by the GSEs and mandated by these contracts that they have with them to monitor the properties. To go out there and, for instance, in the state of California, they have to water it a certain amount of days. They have to mow the lawn. And all these are paid for in the process through the servicing agents. So the agents get this back from Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. And it constitutes approximately 80% of all the properties in the nation. So it's I think starting at the NOD status and the data that we have and the collection of the information is a great way to address blight.
So this 2-year period that you're talking about, that some of these properties stay in the NOD, could it be also that maybe they are in just tougher neighborhoods and the banks are not necessarily moving in on these properties, and so they stay in that process for a lot longer?
That is true.
Okay.
That
impacts my district.
Right.
And it's my neighbors in Sun Valley and
Right.
adjacent to Sun Valley and Arleta, and you see a lot of these properties that
That
have
is-
been in this NOD stage for a long periods of time, and there really isn't an incentive on behalf of the buyer or the person that occupies the property to really do any of the renovations or keep up with the property, because they're going to lose it anyways. So it just makes the community and the neighborhood even more difficult, and the blight and all the issues that come along with it. So
and not to mention property
Right,
taxes.
I mean,
It brings down the property tax value. Exactly.
Something to note about the 80%, the 2 years, et cetera, is a couple things. First of all, we have to distinguish somewhat between historical data and between what is happening in the current market. We're in a much hotter real estate market right now, so that, first of all, a much smaller percentage of those NODs will actually turn into a sale, because there may be value in that property, so they can perhaps find a way to refinance it or to sell it. There was a time when so many of these properties were significantly underwater, and that meant that there just was not necessarily a way to save it. Now, the period between the NOD and when there may be a notice of trustee sale, or in fact a trustee sale, may be extended for a variety of reasons, and that might include that there is a forbearance agreement that has been entered into between the lender and or the servicer and the borrower, and then the borrower is actually complying with that. It may be because a bankruptcy has been filed, which stays the proceedings for a certain period of time. There may be ownership interests or other kinds of legal issues that have arisen. So there are a lot of reasons why it might occur. It should also be noted that, by the way, those properties that are going to sale now, there are more of them that are going to third-party bidders than previously, because there's a vibrant market for those purchases. Less of them are going back to the lender.
But for our program itself, the registry doesn't necessarily, can't do anything about how long that property stays in that NOD phase. There's really nothing we can do about that.
No, but I think that the proactive inspection is going to be the mechanism that will help us with that process. Getting an inspector out there, going through the process of the vacancy ordinance that's already on the books with Department of Building and Safety. And so utilizing that proactive inspection, because again, you are correct. A registry in and itself is not going to create what we want here. I think what we really need to do is have that proactive inspection mechanism as part of identifying the property and knowing what the property is. Today, we don't know that.
And going back to the geo-registry, do you have an estimated timeline of when we can see this being implemented and how much it would cost?
That's something I would have to refer to HCID on.
We are currently, we support the geo-registry that the controllers are recommending. We think it's a mechanism by which we would have a holistic view of that all city departments can utilize in terms of dealing with the issue of foreclosures. Right now, we have our director of systems who is currently talking with consultants or contractors in terms of the design of it and the requirements of it, as well as the cost factor. But as you know, we're still in the audit committee. It would have to be instructed to come up with such a program.
I would just hate to see for another year to go by.
Well,
We're still trying to figure out how to put the geo-registry together.
as soon as we got the recommendation from the controller,
Okay.
we actually started moving on. In fact, we sent and I'll be happy to talk to the controller and or his staff in regards to some of the issues that we just communicated to him regarding the geo-registry.
Sorry, I can open up. Do you have any questions?
Well, on the timing issue, not just the geo-registry, but how fast we're going to see changes to, with all of this to the foreclosed homes is sort of the first question. I don't know.
Well, to answer some of the work that we've done, we have already commenced, we've set out, we've identified 1,500 properties that were not registered from the period of January 1st to May 31st. Of those, 800, we've dwindled them down, gone through and looked through the real quest data to verify that there hasn't been a notice of rescission or any other reason why we wouldn't be moving forward on it, and that the requirement still exists that they are required to register with the registry. And of those, 805 properties were identified. We sent notices to both the beneficiaries and the trustees on all of these properties. And so they have until September 19th to respond and register. We have approximately 200 of those already registered and 600 are outstanding, approximately, that haven't registered. However, we have been in communication and outreach to various banks, Wells Fargo, U.S. Bank, providing them with specific lists of their data. Interestingly enough, we're having to grapple with this situation of understanding who really owns this property, who do we contact. Well, U.S. Bank tells me, well, we're having the same issue because they don't know. MERS didn't work. MERS is being sued for many other issues. It didn't work. We all know that. We couldn't utilize MERS. So we removed it from our ordinance. But conversely, right now, we're working with them. They're going to identify servicers for us and assist us in making sure that these properties get to the right people, the notices, and that we can collaborate and work together for the goal of relieving the blight in our communities.
I'll add one other thing to that, which is that, and again, this is something for the city attorney to opine on, but what we looked at is sort of two versions of how do you assess a property. One is to do sort of a more preliminary assessment to see if there's some obvious outstanding problems in that, and using the funds from the that are collected to do that. And the other is an out-and-out full kind of inspection. So there's also going to be, I think, a difference between the kind of inspection that you would do on a single family versus a multifamily once a foreclosure has actually occurred in terms of issues of habitability, et cetera.
Yeah, I had a couple. One of the things, and we just happened to be, along with, I think, CD7 as being the leaders in foreclosure, primarily dealing with multifamilies in the 8th District. But one of the things that we've watched on this process is that there's a lot of effort, whether it's NFP funds to buy foreclosed property and looking at registers if it's a blighted property that's in foreclosure. But there is little or no effort as it relates to determining how the person got into foreclosure. And what we hear a great deal, first of all, the banks will not readjust the principal. But the other part of it is when all of these mortgages were bundled, many people spent thousands of dollars paying someone, and nobody knows who that someone was, and then now you are in default. And it appears as though that, with the registry, we have a goal of dealing with blighted properties, but it doesn't seem like it distinguishes how you got there, whether you just didn't pay your bill or whether you paid it and it went into a black hole and nobody knows where your money went. And I think sometimes the assumption that the reason it's blighted is you don't have the money to fix it is that part of that concern is you don't know who to pay. And the people you've paid have not done well by your money. And so I think if you narrowly focus and say, let's get rid of blighted property, you can narrowly focus and deal with blighted property. But on the other hand, how did people get to that point A is lost in the discussion. And, we've looked at government programs for NSP. We looked at programs that actually help people get into apartments once they were foreclosed on. But there's little or nothing that says, you by no, other than the fact that you signed a document that you didn't realize what variable interest was, there's no assistance to aid that person, whether the place is blighted or not. They just lose the property, and we then create a system to say, keep this blighted property out of the community or sell it to NSP and let's resell it to somebody. It's almost like a vulture. You say, well, you lose your property, we can't help you, but we're going to buy it, refurbish it, and sell it to somebody that doesn't have a property. So that's the problem we find out, particularly in communities that are plagued by this, that there's really no option or consideration of how that person got where they are. But we have systems in place that will register your property, get you into default, and then begin to look at ways to put your property in another person's hands. And that's where I think we're kind of missing. And I know banks have not been cooperative in redoing the principle, but the whole process of, we have to look at the banks. The banks knew those properties were going to go in foreclosure the day the person walked out of their office, because they sold them something they knew they couldn't afford because they didn't deal with the issue of what their ability to pay. In fact, they had that system that said you can project your income. Well, all of us could buy a house if that were the case. The key is, can you keep it? And I think that's where I get a concern of whether we're really are we basically torching the same people 2 or 3 times, as opposed to figuring out how did they get into this bind, and did they really just ignore their note, or did they pay it to a group of people that now nobody knows and nobody's acknowledging? And that's the plight that many of these people are in.
I think you raised some really interesting and important issues. I'll break it into 2 parts. Part 1, which is kind of examining how how is it that they ended up in foreclosure, and why is it that they're still in foreclosure? And the other is the issue of confusion often in terms of who is the responsible party from the point of view of the lender, the servicer, the beneficiary, etc. So on the first, I think there are ways to perhaps gather better data on exactly what the circumstances are in terms of, was it a refi, was it a cash out, was it a line of credit, was this a purchase money loan, and there are a whole variety of different circumstances, and each one is a little bit different and also suggests perhaps a different kind of strategy. How much you break it up into each and every one of these different causes is a different question. In terms of to whom is the payment to be made and the responsible party, I think you correctly stated that MERS did not turn out to be what so many folks had expected and wanted it to be. And it ended up being, I think, very terribly unfair and a huge mess to so many borrowers who they didn't know to whom to even answer. Mm-hmm. And by the same token also, there were servicers who, even if they wanted necessarily to extend the terms, because these loans had been sold into portfolios and then perhaps even broken up into a variety of tranches, there were a set of rules that were set up in selling these loans that tied their hands of doing this in certain circumstances. So there were, sometimes they just didn't want to cooperate, sometimes they couldn't. There was a whole variety of different reasons. But I think it's fair for, and this is a national issue, not just a Los Angeles or California issue, that borrowers deserve a much better ability to know to whom they're supposed to communicate and with whom the buck actually stops, literally and figuratively. That's a national problem.
Yeah. One thing I was wondering I don't know if it's housing or building and safety, how does the process that deals with blighted property differ from just a blighted house and one that's in foreclosure? Is it much different than our response?
My name's John Beasons from Building and Safety, and the biggest difference now is we have a complaint-based system now, where if there's a blighted property and someone complains about it, then we respond. And there is a mechanism to recover the costs of that inspection in place right now. This foreclosure registry doesn't have an inspection mechanism, and therefore, if they're not based on a complaint, then yeah, we don't have a way to recover the costs of that inspection at this time. But there were motions and a mechanism proposed, and in our budget, last year we had several positions allocated for this, but since there was not an ordinance passed, those positions are no longer there.
You know, one of the things, and this is a kind of a sidetrack, that in reading this particular audit, and I think it's well past time that we looked at it, one of the things that's come up in my tenure here is that the two shortcomings of our council doing its work is that we often ask for ordinances and they never get done. All right, so therefore, and nobody's tracking them. And I don't know if that's a job for the CLA to say when the council utters the word, create an ordinance like it was done in many of these cases, nobody ever determines it to get done. The second thing that's a shortfall is that we did a motion, and the council approved this, that basically said, if you create an ordinance, and it's a major policy, major law change, that in the ordinance it should state what department's responsible, that after a year of this ordinance being in place, they report back how the ordinance is working. Well, that's what's the failure here. People actually, up until you did this audit, were running around the city saying, our registry is the best thing in the world. Problem is, they didn't know it didn't work. And so that also is a shortfall of asking a department that you create an ordinance, that in a year you say back to the council, this ordinance doesn't work, and these are the 12 reasons it doesn't, or in some way that needs to be repaired or altered. Because many of these ordinances sound great when we approve them, but operationally when they hit the department and you say, go implement them, there's all kind of reasons why they don't work. But nobody comes back and says, can we amend it? It just kind of goes again into a darkness that nobody sees. But those are two things I'd like to see if we can add to this report and recommend that we basically ask, I think it's the CLA would maybe the best, that when the council utters the word ordinance, someone is tracking that it actually gets done.
But that's in general. I wanted to recommend that that the department come back in a year and report back.
Oh, no, for this one, yes.
Yeah, to
But
come
I'm just
back
saying
to
in
the
general.
audits committee and give us a status report on the program. But I'll mention that when we
I think in
move the item,
general,
but
it seems like we need to have
we can add that. Sure.
a thing as far as the CLA or somebody monitoring. Plus, again, here's an item that we approved by the council unanimously back in '09. An ordinance never appeared that basically said, when you write ordinances, add a statement in there, who's responsible, and what is your 1-year report?
I will say, I agree with you 100%. In this particular case, and HCID can comment on this more particularly, interestingly enough, this happened to be one of those ordinances that actually did get amended after the fact, after further reports about how it was and was not working. And there were amendments that were made related to the whole issue of MERS. Unfortunately, that didn't quite work out the way it was anticipated either.
No, I think that's the dilemma. Because again, if no more than 6 months ago, or maybe 8 months ago, you would have thought that this was one of the highlights of the city. We're ahead of the game. We're dealing with these issues on foreclosures. And we find out that it has several glaring problems that were never implemented as people thought it was when you approved it.
I think the important thing is to get the inspection mechanism going. Since 2012, there's been a motion to do that. We haven't yet done that with Department of Building and Safety. And so I think that's the mechanism that we need to start, because having a registry doesn't work unless we go out there and understand what is out there, and that's through an inspection. And I've done quite a bit of studies. Over 444 municipalities have the same ordinance across the nation that we do. And a couple of states actually have enacted their own ordinances for other states. And so in doing this research, it all comes down to the inspection mechanism. And so I think that from HCIDLA's perspective, that was missing in the ordinance. And so we know that now. I think we need to move forward and try to do the best that we can going forward. The reality is notice of defaults are still there. We still have approximately 6,600 registered properties to date for just this year alone. Although foreclosures are decreasing, properties in our communities are still staying in the foreclosure process. And so I think it's important, and council members, I think you're bringing that up in your districts, that you're seeing that we do have that enforcement mechanism of an inspection so that we can go out there and do that.
Let me ask you, was the inspection overlooked because of the cost, or was it just not put in the original plan?
There wasn't a plan to implement an
I
inspection.
think within the foreclosure ordinance, there's a vacant property, a standing vacant property ordinance that's in place that's handled by Department of Building and Safety. I think with the ordinance, and we appreciate the controller's recommendations in terms of improving the operation of the ordinance, but I think what was missing was the reality that perhaps that vacant property was not going to address the volume of foreclosures that the city was facing at the height of the foreclosure crisis. And I think what the Councilmember Cedillo was putting forward back in June of this year was to, as Councilwoman Martinez says, let's do it now. Let's stop the delay. Let's get a fee for Department of Building and Safety so they can ramp up their inspection staff to handle the single-family dwellings as well as the vacant multifamily. On the multifamily in the city of Los Angeles, our core, as the Councilmember knows, our core SCEP program and complaint program handle those, whether it be foreclosure or not, to deal with the habitability issues. What's happening is the single-family dwellings are not being addressed. And I think what was lacking in the original ordinance was that, in hindsight, that perhaps we should have enacted a mechanism by which that proactive inspection program would be developed, as well as a fee attached to it in order to fund it, support it.
I want to just add one thing to this, which is that at least as we envision the geo-registry working, and this is up for discussion, of course, that the inspection would be sort of broken up into two types of inspection. Because if you do an inspection starting at the NOD, first of all, you're inspecting a very, very large number of properties. And second of all, how are you going to pay for it? Because that fee may or may not be able to be imposed upon the lender at that time or upon the servicer. And again, the city attorney's office can better opine on this. So, A, we'd be looking at inspecting a huge number, and B, how do you pay for it? So what we recommended as a way around that, as it were, is to look at doing preliminary evaluations, not full-out inspections, but preliminary evaluations at the time that the NOD is recorded. And then at the time that the property is sold, that there would be a full-out inspection.
I have a quick question. I know in the report there's mention about the $5 million that were collected in registration fees. You
Yes.
also mentioned a $3.7 million special fund. Is that the same money, or is it?
No, it's the same, and
So is
there's
that what is left over?
yes. That would be correct.
Left over because the registration fee is different than the nuisance abatement.
That is exactly right.
Otherwise, there would have been plenty
Right,
of places to
you,
spend it.
there would be plenty of places to spend it, but given how the ordinance was structured, there are issues about how you can and can't spend that money.
Because theoretically, the fee for that was really just to create and maintain the registry.
That is correct.
So we can't. So if it's so in some ways maybe we're charging too much for the registry and maybe not enough for the inspections and for the.
Well, there has to be some sort of linkage between that fee, as you know, and what it gets spent on. What my rationale was in having this preliminary evaluation program was that if you have the registry in order to then conduct inspections, and again, this is something for the city attorney to opine on, but if you do that, then your hands may be tied about how you can spend that registration money. But if a preliminary evaluation and, let's say, assessing a grade is part of the assemblage of a registry, then arguably it is an appropriate use of that money to do those preliminary evaluations for the purposes of having a grade, for the purposes of having the registry, and therefore you have found potentially a way to use those funds in a constructive way. But we have a city attorney representative
We have a
here.
smart controller, that's why, right?
Well, we've got very smart city attorneys as well. So, thank you.
All right. Do you have any other questions? If not,
Yeah. Where is the motion, the Cedillo-Krikorian motion to do? I'm not sure it has. That was going to do the various amendments that we did back in June in the joint budget, housing. The changes that you're recommending, you have the 7 changes, and change number 1 is basically that motion. Where are we with that?
isn't it in committee?
As you know, Councilmember Bloomfield, you were in the joint Budget and Finance and Housing. It was approved at that point.
I remember we signed off, but and then it went into the black hole. So
That's the last on the clerk's calendar. That's the last action item. Of course, then we had the audit committee, and I would imagine this item will go before the full council.
I also wanted to recommend that item be moved to council at the same time
Yes,
as the ordinance.
I think that would
We
be
can take
appropriate.
them up at the same time.
great. So it's wherever it may be out
It'll
in the
come-
ether.
it'll make its way
we're,
back.
We're grabbing it
That's
and
right, and
making it part of this and pushing it to council. 'Cause
Correct.
We want to see that happen.
And Jenny's saying yes.
Good. No, that's great, and that's a very constructive role for this committee to do. And the other thing, I mean, all of the suggestions that the controller made, I think, are really solid, and I appreciate the time and thought and analysis that went into that, and it's nice to see. It's a intractable problem that we need to find ways into, and this is a good step in that regard. And I don't know exactly how we get around the problems that you were pointing out in terms of the NOD and the REO, but this is a good step.
I don't know that one ordinance can solve everything.
No.
But let's figure out what's out there to begin with.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just want to say thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, for the great attention that you're paying to this. I think that it's a wonderful opportunity to really make some progress on this issue, to really address so many of the blighted properties that we still have. I wanted to again thank HCID and really also thank my auditors from our auditing shop at the Controller's Office, who did just a really wonderful job. Kudos to you.
We also like to thank the Controller's Office and the staff. We learned a lot from this audit. There was 7 recommendations, 6 were directly addressed to the Housing and Community Investment Department. We just transmitted, as the Controller said, a progress report on the 6 recommendations in terms of the action items that we've taken towards fulfilling those, and we look forward to meeting with them on the Registry as well.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So, Mr. Clerk, I'd like to receive and file the performance audit and request that the Housing and Community Investment Department report back to the Audits Committee in a year on the status of the program. Also like to recommend that this item be moved to council at the same time as the ordinance. And in addition, I'd like to recommend that we implement the new distressed property Registry as follows in Appendix 2 of the performance audits, and direct HCID to coordinate with other affected departments. Good? No objections? Oh,
Can we ask that the city attorney do what we asked him to do in 09?
that the city attorney asked.
That we asked the city attorney to implement what the council approved in 09, that they add to ordinances a report back mechanism.
Oh, a report back mechanism on the ordinances that the city council approves. Do you need a copy of this?
Thank you again.
Thank you very much. No objections. Do we have any cards in general public comment?
None, Madam Chair.
No? Okay, then this concludes our audit committee. Thank you very much. This meeting is adjourned. And we got you before.